today we will be presenting final briefings, and there are a bunch of things about this I hope you pay some attention to. Obviously the content of the briefings, but I also want you to be thinking about this workshop as I've wanted you to think about it all semester, as a process. In other words, there are things that you did over the course of the past couple of months to learn about a new piece of legislation, about a new issue, the policy and scientific elements of that issue, and you have developed a fairly deep level of expertise over these couple of months about the issue you've been focusing on. This process, in a field as complex as ours, you will be replicating over and over again in your career. I started in water pollution, I went to toxic waste, I went to leaking underground storage tanks, I went to nuclear waste, eventually climate change, and a variety of other issues, all of which I knew nothing about when I started, and then I gradually became more expert in it. This is a process where you accelerate the development of that expertise. And so I want you to think about, how did I learn this stuff? And what was valuable about the group interactions, different people teaching me and communicating with me, and the arguments we've had about what was important and what wasn't important, and those debates are all part of this process. And so as you listen to the other workshop briefings today, be thinking about these briefings also as a way to educate yourself and inform yourself about issues you have not been as deeply involved in, because this is really the kind of process that you'll be doing, hopefully, for your entire career. So we're going to begin with Professor Apson's group, who will give us a briefing on the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act. So the briefer's here.
Hello, my name is Kate Zabinsky, and today I will be presenting on S3484, the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act. I want to start off by thanking my team for all the hard work they put in this summer, and especially to my deputy, Lauren Farmer, and our faculty advisor, Professor Apson. So today we're going to go through an overview of the bill, its main priorities, what some success indicators are, as well as some case studies, and finally some key takeaways. So the bill was introduced in January by Senator Cory Booker. It's currently in committee. As a quick reminder, a watershed is not just a body or bodies of water, but it's the land that drains into them. In fact, you're currently sitting on the watershed that our bill deals with, as the land that Columbia is on drains into the Hudson, which is part of the watershed, along with the New York, New Jersey Harbor, the Mohawk River, the Bronx River, the Raritan Passaic, and the Hackensack in New Jersey. So the bill provides $50 million a year in funding. It will be administered by the Department of the Interior, that will be able to coordinate across state lines with agencies such as the EPA, NOAA, the National Park Service, with governors of New York and New Jersey, Native American tribes, and other organizations and agencies. So this watershed is not only the most populous watershed in the United States, but it's of great financial importance. It takes in more than $60 billion a year from tourism, commercial fishing, and recreation alone. So the bill has four main priorities: water quality improvement, flood management and climate change resilience, wildlife habitat restoration and protection, and environmental justice, which the bill defines as community access, education, and public health. So in a minute, I'm going to walk you through some case studies that are examples of what this bill would help fund and coordinate. But before that, I want to talk about how these projects will be evaluated. So each situation needs a common model that should be used to evaluate the problem, the solution, and potential success. So we start by gathering the resources that are needed for the potential solution, followed by using them to create and plan and implement the solution. And the output is the result of the process, and this is where accurate and measurable data is key. And the outcome is, hopefully, restoration of the watershed. So for our first case study, we go just to the west in the lower Passaic River. So one detriment to water quality is legacy pollutants. These are pollutants that come from industrial installations that, while they're no longer actively discharging pollution into the water, are still causing problems to these days. So these pollutants can cause major health problems such as gastrointestinal and respiratory disease. One way to remove them is to dredge the riverbed, which can hopefully remove things, for example, such as PCBs and heavy metals. There are risks to dredging, such as reduced dissolved oxygen levels and habitat destruction. So in this photo, you actually see the active project that's going on right now, and it's near a factory that in the 1960s produced Agent Orange. Like I said, the legacy pollutants hang around for a long time. So the next case study, we're going to go up into the Catskills and talk about flood management. So one issue these days with increased precipitation combined with developed and impermeable surfaces is combined sewer overflows, or CSOs, and this is when sewers reach capacity and the sewage, untreated sewage, ends up going directly into nearby water bodies. So green infrastructure such as riparian buffers, one of which you can see here from Tannersville, can be used to mitigate such of these issues. There are possible risks with green infrastructure, including groundwater contamination from permeable pavement, while the water might not be discharged into the body of water, water with things such as motor oil or other pollutants can seep into the groundwater. Permeable pavements also have relatively low speed limits, about 30 miles an hour, so there's limited use. And there's also, from an environmental justice perspective, an issue of green gentrification, in where adding this greenery can sometimes increase property values and desirability of the area and push current residents out. So Tannersville, New York was devastated by Tropical Storm Irene. This storm damage is not just an issue for the coast. They had water damage in homes, they had sinkholes on Main Street, and they had huge amounts of sewage overflow. So they decided to implement some of these green infrastructure techniques. The project is very recent, but scientific evaluations suggest that the reduction of runoff will help lower phosphates by 72% and nitrates flowing into the water by 55%. So next we're going to go a little further south to Wappingers Creek. So dams can disrupt the natural flow of water and block migration of species such as this American eel. While removing a dam can restore these flows, there's also risks, such as no return to pre-dam conditions and short-term sedimentation from the increased flow of water upon removal. So despite this, the dam was removed in 2016. From a animal habitat restoration point of view, this was a success. American eel numbers grew from 50,000 1 year before the dam removal in 2015 to 400,000 eels in 2020. That's an 800% increase. So lastly, we're going to come back to our neighborhood in the New York, New Jersey harbor. So in the harbor, as well as the Raritan in New Jersey, there are efforts to seed oyster reefs, and these oyster reefs are a great example of all four of the priorities coming together. So in terms of water quality, one oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. They can help reduce flooding and slow erosion by breaking up wave energy as it comes in. The reef seeding restores habitats not only of the oysters, which used to be quite abundant in these waters, but also of the organisms that live amongst the oysters. And as far as environmental justice, which I said is defined in this bill partly as education and community engagement, more than 8,000 public school children have been involved in this project. So finally, some key takeaways. The first is that all problems must be evaluated scientifically, and all the solutions must consider both scientific evidence and social equity. It's a federal bill that funds and coordinates between multiple case studies, and in doing so, it will help complement some of the projects that I talked you through, as well as expand on them and fund new ones. And all of this is essential for implementation, which we will be exploring more this fall. Thank you, and any questions?
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was amazing. It seems like a lot of the solutions you talked about are for more urban areas. Is there anything being done in the more rural areas of the watershed?
So the riparian buffers that I talked about can be used in rural areas. They're used a lot to as a barrier between agricultural land. Agricultural runoff is an issue, and rivers. And there's also something called cover crops, which can be planted between growing seasons that can help absorb some of the water and runoff and keep the soil healthy.
Awesome, thank you.
Sorry, you talked a little bit about oyster restoration and you mentioned reef seeding, and I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about like what that process entails.
So there's a project in New York City, it's called the Billion Oyster Project. And what they do actually is collect oyster shells from a bunch of restaurants and other sources, and they put them into these big cages and then drop them into non-navigable, so they can't put them in certain areas, but they will put them, and the oysters will then grow, because oysters need an empty shell in order to go into them and live there. And the idea is they're not going to drop 1 billion oysters in, but the hope is that they will breed themselves and eventually reach high numbers.
Okay, the second group is going to be giving their briefing on the Energy Security and Independence Act of 2022, an act which you may have heard about, something called the Deficit Reduction Act, which was passed recently, and elements of that bill are shared by this bill. And so if our briefer is ready, why don't we begin?
Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Cohen, for the introduction. Good morning. My name is Talahin Gadao. I'm delighted to be here today on behalf of the Energy Security and Independence Act team. So, first and foremost, I'd like to thank my wonderful team, as well as our faculty advisor, Professor Cohen. Today, I'm going to introduce you to the environmental context of our bill. Then, I will talk about the bill itself, the solutions it proposes, and the measures we suggest to measure its success. Finally, I'll discuss our key takeaways and talk about our future steps. But before we dive into talking about the bill, we will first talk about what it indirectly aims to tackle: climate change. Climate change is defined by the UN as long-term shifts in weather patterns and temperatures. This process is primarily affected by greenhouse gases, the most common of which is carbon dioxide. Greenhouse gases are located in the troposphere and are able to trap radiation and re-emit it into the atmosphere. By doing this, they actually make our planet comfortable for human lives. However, due to anthropogenic causes, the levels of greenhouse gases rose dramatically, as indicated in this graph, which led to global warming. The world emits around 50 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year, the majority of which comes from the energy sector, which accounts for 73% of the total global emissions. According to the EPA, the United States emitted 5,222 million tons of carbon dioxide in 2020 alone, and was found to be the world's most significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions since the 18th century. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 75% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions originates from the energy sector, which accounts for 73% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. The energy sector actually uses mostly petroleum, which on its own accounts for 46% of the American emissions. So, as established, greenhouse gases cause climate change. Climate change, on the other hand, leads to disastrous environmental effects. These effects include severe and frequent weather events, rising sea levels, and disruptions to the global energy supply and security, all of which threaten human lives. But despite all of this, the transition to renewable energy in the US is considered to be somewhat controversial. 72% of Americans believe climate change exists, but 56% of Americans believe it's caused mostly by humans. Additionally, changing geopolitical situation has vast impacts on renewable energy supply chains. Energy transition minerals, for example, are more geographically concentrated, as is their refinement, which may lead to supply chain disruptions. Furthermore, the transition to 100% renewable energy is expected to have high upfront investment, which may also act as a deterrent. And this is exactly what our bill aims to tackle. The Energy Security and Independence Act promotes the reduction of reliance on foreign countries for fossil fuels, as well as renewable energy sources and materials. It's doing this by defining energy as a necessary strategic asset and the access to energy as a strategic interest of the United States. It aims to decrease the American usage of fossil fuels by promoting the local renewable energy sector in a way that makes the US self-sufficient by utilizing renewable energy. The bill has 5 main goals: reframing energy as a national security concern, combating reliance on foreign fossil fuels, combating bolstering domestic renewable energy supply chains, providing funds to increase energy efficiency through weatherization and public heat pumps, and finally, prioritizing environmental justice communities. The bill allocates $100 billion through the Defense Production Act to reinvigorate the domestic clean energy industrial base. $10 billion will be allocated through loans and grants to bolster the renewable energy supply chain. $30 billion will be used to fund weatherization, and $10 billion will be dedicated to reducing consumption of imported fossil fuels by installing public heat pumps. We found that the Energy Security and Independence Act has 3 main solutions to promote its target. The first is expanding the Defense Production Act to increase domestic production of renewable energy. The Defense Production Act is a federal law from 1950 that enables the president to direct the local market to support national efforts in time of need. By expanding the DPA to include renewable energy as a matter of national security, the Energy Security and Independence Act aims to utilize 2 main titles. The first is Title I, which will allow the president to determine which renewable energy goods are critical. It will also enable the president to prioritize governmental contracts in order to produce these goods. The second is Title III, which is the expansion of production capacity and supply. Essentially, it will allow the president to give tangible guarantees to businesses, which will allow these businesses to increase their production capacity and supply strategic goods. The expansion of the DPA is really the main solution proposed by the bill. By reframing renewable energy as a critical good, it will allow a substantial increase in government investment in the sector, as well as the expansion of the usage of renewable energy in the United States as a whole. Through the DPA, the president will have the ability to rapidly mobilize the production of renewable energy in the interest of national security. The second solution is investing in the renewable energy supply chain, while also prioritizing projects which will benefit environmental justice communities. Moreover, this solution aims to create a geographic concentration of manufacturers in the manufacturing supply chain and is expected to create more domestic jobs in the renewable energy sector. The third solution focuses on investing in energy efficiency through weatherization and heat pumps. By investing in energy efficiency, the bill aims to lower the need itself for energy, thus lowering carbon emissions caused by fossil fuels. Weatherization and heat pumps regulate buildings' temperatures while using minimal energy. This will be especially important for environmental justice communities, as it was found that around 25 to 50% of their household income is spent on energy. The Energy Security and Independence Act is a multifaceted bill with implications for energy security, renewable energy supply chains, and environmental justice communities. We believe that a range of different indicators will be needed in order to gauge the bill's success in achieving its several goals. Among them are the increase in domestic renewable energy infrastructure, the increase in share of energy from renewable sources, and the increased energy efficiency in households and public buildings. Finally, let's discuss our key takeaways. The Energy Security and Independence Act aims to bolster the U.S. energy independence by expanding its renewable energy sector. This will be done by investing in renewable energy systems and technologies, setting up a domestic supply chain, while also prioritizing environmental justice communities. The Act leverages the DPA to reframe energy as a matter of national security in order to increase the share of renewable energy to eventually reach 100%. Next semester, we will conduct a political and technical feasibility analysis, and we'll focus on the policy aspects of the bill. Thank you all for taking part in our journey to learn more about this bill this past semester. Any questions?
Great presentation. So my question is that does the bill specifically talk about like which type of renewable energy to support and whether the U.S. has sufficient resource and capacity to build them domestically?
So the bill doesn't talk specifically about which technologies to support, but it does mention solar energy, as it does have actually a very high potential in order to bolster the American renewable energy sector. And actually, one would only need 0.4% of the U.S. land in order to use solar energy to light up the whole country. Yeah, that's about it.
Hi, thanks for that excellent presentation. A related question to Song's is did you, in the kind of controversies exploration, did you encounter any sort of environmental impact of the domestic supply chain for renewables in terms of extracting resources or manufacturing? And did you expect a sort of not in my backyard response to the domestic supply chain?
So that's a great question. Considering that we are talking about minerals that might not necessarily be in the States, it's definitely a con when it comes to the bill because it doesn't address it specifically. However, when it comes to not in my backyard sort of attitude, considering that only 56% of the American people believe that climate change is caused by human actions, we can expect that maybe it would be somewhat controversial, but again, the bill doesn't necessarily address that.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation, Tal. I just wanted to ask about the feasibility of heat pumps. How easy are they to install on buildings, and do the current types of heat pumps that exist out there can handle the capacity of, like, let's say, like a 17-story building? So yeah, how feasible are they to install and utilize, like right now, if we were to put them on every building?
So actually, when it comes to heat pumps, there are various kinds of heat pumps. From my knowledge anyway, the most common of which is an ERA heat pump. They're very effective when it comes to regulating buildings' temperatures. To say if they would be able to regulate the temperature of a 17-floor building, I would assume yes, but don't hold me on that. If you want, I would be able to look into that and get back to you. But generally speaking, it's a very well-established technology, and it is used in a lot of different places in the U.S. And so, yeah, I'll get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering about bolstering the production of renewable energy technology in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Do they expect that those industries will be able to compete with cheap solar panels from abroad? And are there any mechanisms in place to protect U.S. industry in case that they are not price competitive?
So because the bill actually plans to allocate a lot of money in order to fund the local market, then maybe it would be able to also assist specific companies when it comes to manufacturing these sort of technologies. But when it comes to competing with companies from abroad and foreign imports, that's still to be figured out. Yeah. Thank you.
Our next briefing will focus on wildlife corridors. Yes, it's a very exciting topic. Professor Cook and Professor Jocelyn look very enthusiastic today. And so if our briefer is ready, Emily, why don't we begin?
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Sankum and I'd like to welcome you all to the final briefing for the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act. I'd like to first thank my advisor, Dr. Cook, as well as the rest of my team for their efforts throughout the semester. And before we actually begin the presentation, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement to recognize that we are on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Lenape people, and we honor and pay respect to all Indigenous peoples by recognizing their relationship with this land. So today we'll go over 6 different topics. The first is background, then we'll go over problems addressed and solutions proposed by the bill, how the bill implements the solutions, and scientific controversies and metrics. Then we'll conclude with some key takeaways. So first, some background. So the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act was first introduced in August of 2021 by Senator Lujan and Representative Gallego in order to create wildlife corridors, which are just areas of land that connect habitats within tribal lands. And so this is an effort from the federal government to shift to a legislative framework that is focused on self-sovereignty and trying to give power and funding back to tribal nations so that they can govern themselves and make land use decisions. So next, we'll go into some problems that are addressed by this bill. So this act addresses important problems concerning the environment. The first issue is the environmental problems created for wildlife. So habitat fragmentation is just parts of a habitat become destroyed, and then they leave behind smaller unconnected areas, which then causes isolation and lack of resources. Then climate change exacerbates this because species have to migrate in order to find more suitable habitat, but they can't do that if the habitats are unsafe to cross or if they're fragmented. And so this negatively impacts their ability to move to access food and water, mates, suitable habitats, which thus impacts their ability to survive, grow, and reproduce. This results in a loss of genetic diversity and a decrease in biodiversity. The social problem of tribal land management and funding is the second issue addressed by this act. So tribal lands are complex in that there's a variety of landowners. So there's non-native owners of land, native owners, and then there's federal lands. And so this can make it very difficult to coordinate in order to actually implement tribal wildlife corridors. And so this is coupled with U.S. Government underfunding tribal programs and thus leads to limitations to land management. So next we'll discuss what solutions are actually proposed by the bill to address these issues. So the solution to isolated wildlife populations is the implementation of wildlife corridors. So as I mentioned before, these are just areas of degraded, often fragmented habitat, and they're restored to enable isolated wildlife populations to once again migrate and breed. So the habitat degradation usually occurs from human activities, such as like roads, cultivated land, or maybe natural resource extraction. And so by increasing connectivity, we increase migration and breeding, which thus increases biodiversity. And so there's 2 types of connectivity, which is structural and functional. Structural connectivity just measures the physical arrangement of a habitat, and functional considers how well genes move through a habitat. Together, the both of them improve wildlife migration, thus improving area habitability and the transfer of genes between populations. One great example of a wildlife corridor is the Yellowstone to Uconn initiative. We can see in 1993, just before it's starting, the green areas are protected areas, and the yellow are conservation areas, which is much smaller, and conservation areas might include corridors as well. We can see 2013, 20 years after the start of the initiative, there are a lot more, about 50% more yellow areas. And so this indicates that by identifying areas that would be great for corridors and coordinating with private landowners, we can actually increase natural and genetically diverse species reproduction, as well as expand the range for species. But how do we know that actually occurs? So let's look at a case within Yellowstone to Uconn. So if we look at grizzly bears specifically, it's a little bit difficult to see, but the smaller brown line within that map is the 1980s range of grizzly bears. We can see that in 2016, the black line is the range of grizzly bears, which has increased over 100% for the range. The population has also increased from 400 to 1,700. And so this suggests larger ranges are generally good news for species. And so another important question to ask is why wildlife corridors are needed on tribal land specifically. So we see here, this is just displaying GAP Status 1 and GAP Status 2, which are just government designations for land managed for biodiversity. And so when we add in Native American reservations, we can see that many of these areas are closely associated with the protected areas. And so by adding them in, we can expand the range for many species. So our team made this map with data from the North American Environmental Atlas. And so we specifically chose these species, the black bear, black-tailed prairie dog, and spotted owl, because they're all migratory, endemic, and transboundary. That essentially just means that they cross the United States, Mexico, Canada, as well as tribal lands. And so when we look at these species, we can see that native reservations are a significant part of the land for them. And this is actually true for 30 of the 33 priority species recognized by the U.S. Geological Survey. And so this tells us that tribal lands are crucial for protecting migratory pathways as well as species ranges. So it's beneficial to create corridors here to increase connectivity to protected lands and therefore increase protected lands' ability to protect biodiversity. The second solution is to provide land management in order to address land management assistance in order to address tribal land management. This comes in the form of technical assistance, funding, and coordination. So more specifically, to understand why assistance is needed, we can see here a map of the Rosebud Reservation, which kind of resembles a checkerboard. So we can see that red and yellow are lands held by natives, and then white is privately owned land, and orange is federal reserve land. And so obviously, it would be a bit difficult to coordinate with them because there's so many different types of landowners, and it can cost a lot of time and money, as well as a bunch of other factors. And so the technical assistance provided by this legislation would provide the tribes with the means to actually implement wildlife corridors on tribal lands. And so to kind of explain what the mechanisms of this are, technical assistance is just improving access to wildlife data for tribes, as well as working with voluntary private landowners. And then funding is where the bill authorizes up to $50 million annually for tribes to actually receive grants and manage wildlife corridors. And then coordination is just allowing them to work with U.S. government agencies and tribes and other stakeholders involved in the process. So next, we'll discuss how the bill actually implements these solutions. So the bill has a procedure that requires the U.S. and government and tribes to actually work together. So first, the tribe nominates a wildlife corridor, and then the Secretary of Interior has 90 days to make a decision as to whether it meets the criteria. If it does, then they can provide grants and technical assistance to the tribes, and this therefore expands corridors as well as coordination with governments, tribes, and other stakeholders involved in the process. There are some controversies and that we will discuss, as well as ways to measure whether this program would actually succeed. So some controversies are increased predation, invasive species, spread of fire, and potential for disease, because they can move along corridors from one habitat and be introduced into another. However, a lot of these studies have been done in more closed settings, so they might not be more applicable to corridors, and so more research is needed in order to better understand their impacts and manage the corridors. So there are two types of indicators we can use to actually see whether or not these wildlife corridors are successful. So first are the scientific indicators, and we can use the number of species utilizing the corridor, as well as the number of individuals of umbrella species, which are just species where, when protected, they lend themselves to the protection of other species. We can also look at the transfer of genes within populations, as well as the acres of land protected in the US. We also might want to look at social indicators, such as the number of corridors nominated by tribes, which is probably the most important indicator because we want to know if the tribes are actually wanting to implement the corridors. Some other indicators might be community engagement and government collaboration, which is just trying to see if the community is getting involved with the management process and putting in their ideas, as well as if the government of the US and the tribes are working together. Overall, it seems pretty apparent that the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act would be very beneficial to both wildlife, tribes, and so habitat fragmentation and climate change are causing biodiversity loss, and so wildlife corridors can increase connectivity and reduce the impacts of fragmentation. And so the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act provides a mechanism for tribes to implement corridors. Thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. I just had a question about, since you are working with tribal lands and tribal nations, does the bill discuss or designate any collaboration with the tribal people about like traditional knowledge that they might want to apply to, I don't know, a specific species or something along those lines about promoting biodiversity?
Yeah, so when this bill was first introduced, it was actually brought up to, I think, Senator Lujan. I forget which person it was exactly. But it was actually from the tribes themselves coming up to them and saying, hey, we want to be able to implement such an act. And a lot of the tribes actually, it's not like creating a corridor. Many of them want to be able to have these wildlife corridors, but they don't have the funds to do so. So obviously many of them have traditional knowledge that they'd like to apply to manage their land. And so this bill isn't necessarily like the US government like managing it like as a co-op. It's more of them providing assistance for them to be able to do so. So the tribes more so have the, I don't know what the exact word is, but they're the ones kind of like, figuring out what kind of knowledge to use with the lands. I'm not sure exactly of what kind of knowledge that is, but from my experience, what I've learned about it is that they have very specific ways of thinking about nature and their relationships with them. So I would assume they would apply that here.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a quick question. Can you explain a bit more how climate change can affect migration and biodiversity loss, and how the bill is going to tackle those issues?
Yeah, I do have a slide on that actually. So climate change is causing increases in temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, increases in droughts and waves, and stronger hurricanes. So there could be a lot more natural disasters or just other things that might make the habitats for species less suitable. And so these changes are impacting ecosystems and forcing them to move. And so habitat degradation and climate change would impact migration and result in biodiversity loss. And so when we look at the common loon, we can see a shifting range of where they generally reside. The red used to be suitable habitat, but it's now unsuitable, so they have to move more into the blue section where you can see that 18% of the range has been gained, and in the red, 27% of the range has been lost.
Thanks for the presentation. This may not be strictly in scope of what you researched, but I'm curious to hear if you came across any international agreements or arrangements for inter-country wildlife corridors, since you mentioned that species often cross across boundaries. So I was just curious to see if you came across any successful arrangements in that regard.
I don't believe that this is something we specifically researched, since this is more of a national bill, but I do believe that there's legislation that, for instance, from my personal knowledge, this is kind of a bit different, but I know of the International Whaling Commission is specifically for whales, well, obviously it's for whales, but obviously the other countries would have to work together in order to kind of understand how they can really, what is the word? Rule, I guess, for lack of a better word, how to kind of manage these wildlife. And so I imagine there's plenty of those in place for other wildlife as well.
Thank you.
We've been talking a lot about invasive species and pathogens. Does this bill address on how it might try to stop invasive species from spreading through the U.S.?
Just invasive species in general?
I would assume that the land corridors would also help invasive species move around more easily. So I was wondering if there are any safeguards in place.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this is one of the considerations that is something people have considered as to whether or not invasive species would be able to move more easily through the wildlife corridors, but I think from what I've read, wildlife corridor designers have to take that more into consideration, because they have to actually figure out how are the, I guess for instance, plants, are they going to flow through the habitats, or maybe they just need to examine it more in an actual corridor setting as opposed to labs, so that they can see whether this actually has an impact, because it hasn't been as well studied from what we've seen. Thank you.
We're very into wildlife this semester. And so our next briefing is Professor Palmer's group, and they're going to talk to us about Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2022. So let's begin.
Thank you for the introduction, Professor Cohen, and thank you to everyone for coming. My name is Ezekiel Mabin, and I'm tremendously excited to speak to you today about our bill, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2022. I'd like to give a special thanks to my entire team, as well as Malika and Courtney, who helped make this presentation possible, and to our advisor, Matt Palmer. So I want to talk to you today about several things. The first is the biodiversity decline in the United States. The second is the current state of conservation funding in the U.S. The third is the Recovering America's Wildlife Bill Act of 2022, our bill, and how it would change the policy landscape around conservation funding. The fourth are some conservation and wildlife management practices that are currently implemented and can be implemented further with the funding from our bill. And the fifth are the potential impacts of the bill and how they would be measured over time. So first and foremost, why do we need a Recovering America's Wildlife Act? We need it because wildlife populations in the U.S. are suffering catastrophic decline. We've lost 33% of wild animal populations in the U.S., and that rate is growing, and that rate is only among species that we've recorded. Those rates might be even higher among things that are harder to measure, like certain species of insect and fungi. And so one species that has been particularly hard hit and is particularly important to the ecosystem is the American bumblebee. It was previously one of America's most widespread pollinators, but it's suffered a 90% decline in population since 1990, and it's nearly been extirpated from the state that gives it its scientific name. And this decline has been precipitous. In 1980, the American bumblebee was 12% of all bees observed in the United States. And in 2012, it was less than 1%. And the causes for this decline have been multiple, and they're interlinked. Pollution, especially overuse of neonicotinoid insecticides, harms the bee's immune system, which makes it more susceptible to disease spread by non-native honeybees. And habitat loss is a major driver of decline as well, as agricultural land clears native prairie for human use. And this, of course, is all exacerbated by climate change. The full effects on insect populations, we don't know the full extent of. And as you can see here, these red states are where the bee has declined by more than 90%. Those green dots are former areas where the bee was sighted. And so you see a lot of green in those red states and not a lot of black, which is current sightings, more recent sightings of the bee. And as populations of important pollinators like the American bumblebee decline, you end up seeing a vicious cycle, where as important species decline in population, sometimes they go extinct. And this causes ecosystems that they support to become more fragile, which then causes the populations of other species to decline, which causes more extinctions, more fragile ecosystems, and it leads to a cycle like we're seeing now, where extinction rates are skyrocketing, with some reaching as much as 2, for some types of species, such as amphibians, 2.5 out of a million species going extinct every year, which is far above the base rate that we're used to. So how do we deal with this? Well, we already have some tools for dealing with wildlife populations in this country and for recovering them. And two that would be built upon by our bill are the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. I want to speak about the Endangered Species Act first because it's the primary framework for protecting biodiversity in the United States. And it's extremely good at keeping species from going extinct, which is the first part of its job. It's prevented extinction in 99% of all species ever listed. There are currently about 1,600 listed right now. And it does this through a series of financial and regulatory systems and penalties to prevent the killing of endangered species and protect their habitat. However, the second part of its job, which is recovering endangered species populations, it has not been nearly as successful at. Only 46 species have ever been successfully fully recovered off the Endangered Species Act. And this is in part because the Endangered Species Act does not receive nearly as much funding it needs to implement the recovery plans that are provided to species when they're listed on the Act. As you can see, the number of the Endangered Species Act increases pretty regularly, and as species go on, they're mandated to receive a recovery plan, which details their habitat, and details the reasons for their decline, and what can be done to help improve the species numbers. However, only 57% of all listed species have an active recovery plan, and of those, only 12% are fully funded. And as new species are added, this money and these recovery plans are spread thinner and thinner and thinner. And this is because funding is not sufficient. This number right here is $700 million, seems like a very big number, and it is. It's the money provided by the Pittman-Robertson Act, which is the primary funder for wildlife conservation in the primary dedicated funding stream for wildlife conservation in the United States. And it's funded by taxes on firearms and other hunting equipment. But this $700 million is just a third of the $2.3 billion that is estimated to be needed to implement existing recovery plans that are under the ESA. So we have less than a third of the money that we need to recover species listed under the ESA. And that's not even including non-endangered species that also might need protection and help. And this leaves us in a situation where conservation managers have to make really hard choices. Do they focus on saving the most endangered species and spend a lot of money doing so, those costly successes in the upper right-hand corner? Or do they try and avoid injurious neglect, where species that could have been helped by early intervention are neglected and don't recover their populations, even though they could have? And so this is where the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2022 comes in. It aims to help bridge the gap in wildlife funding by providing $1.3 billion every year in perpetuity for conservation in the wildlife conservation in the United States, spread through all 50 states, providing $100 million, almost $100 million a year in funding to Indian tribes to help them with wildlife recovery on their reservations, and almost $200 million a year for the next 5 years to help the Endangered Species Act fulfill its functions and clear some of that endangered species backlog that I was talking about. And as you can see, by 2025, we'll be meeting that $2.3 billion budgetary need for funding ESA recovery plans. And once we have that money, there's a lot we can do with it, and a lot that we've been doing already with the funds that we have. Protected habitat is one of the most effective ways to recover wildlife in the United States. And species on protected land suffer half the habitat losses as on comparable unprotected land. And the swift fox pictured here is a great example of a species that has been protected through a combination of state and local action, which I'll get into in a moment. And so the swift fox disappeared from 90% of its historic range by 1992. However, state and local agencies coordinated to protect and improve its habitat. And by 2017, the swift fox had covered 40% of its historic range, as shown here on this map. And this was done all without listing it on the endangered species list. And as you can see here, these are the areas that are permanently protected for biodiversity in green. And those red areas are areas of highly imperiled biodiversity. So there's a lot of space in the United States for more room for protected areas, either through federal or state protection or through systems like conservation easements, which are another way of protecting wildlife without having to set this land aside entirely for wildlife conservation. In a situation where a species numbers have declined precipitously and it's unable to recover in its habitat, captive breeding is a great way to bring those numbers back up, though it's not without its problems. In captive breeding, zoos and refuges breed animals and then release them into the wild. However, these individuals can have trouble acclimating to the wild, and it can be very expensive. A great example of this is the Hawaiian nene, which was the last remaining native Hawaiian goose species. If it had gone extinct, it would have been a huge blow to both the biodiversity and culture of Hawaii. And so there were 30 left in 1951 when captive breeding efforts began. And from 1960 to 2008, 2,800 nene were reintroduced. And in 2019, the population had risen to more than 3,000 when it was delisted from the endangered species down to threatened instead of endangered. However, this was incredibly expensive. This effort cost $2 million a year over the last 10 years of the program, and it cost even more going all the way back to 1960. So it's better to intervene early if you can. And so returning to our friend, the American bumblebee, there's a lot that we can do to help it if we are provided sufficient funding. We can protect its existing habitat through conservation, habitat conservation. We can breed new colonies and reintroduce them to that habitat to help bring the population back up. And we can fund long-term monitoring of bee populations and bee habitat to make sure that our efforts are working. And indeed, that long-term monitoring is how we'll know if our additional funding is succeeding in its purpose. If we see increasing wildlife populations and growing species range and greater genetic diversity within individual species, we will know that our conservation efforts are succeeding on a species level. And if we see expanded protected areas, more active recovery plans, and a lot of species going off the ESA in the right direction, recovered, then we know that our plans are working on a macro level, on a systems policy level. So some key takeaways from this are that biodiversity in America is threatened, but that we can help to alleviate that threat through proper conservation management. And that management requires extensive funding. And if we want to plan long-term and have successful efforts over the coming century, we will need consistent funding that can be relied upon year on year. And that is what the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2022 provides. Next semester, we will go further into how our bill might be implemented. And I'm very glad that I had the chance to present this to you. And please, if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you. That was incredible. Congratulations. My question was, you mentioned that some of the causes of these issues are obviously complex, but one of them has to do with climate change. And I was just curious in your studies and research, if you found that, let's say the US stopped emitting tomorrow, would some of these issues be remediated, or would it be kind of we're already at this point where now we have to focus on each individual species?
So climate change is not the only driver of biodiversity decline. It's a big one, and it's one that we don't know as much about as we know about other drivers. The issue with that is if we stopped emitting tomorrow, there would be other countries that would still be emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. If the world stopped emitting tomorrow, we would still be dealing with a lot of drivers of population loss, like land use changes and other forms of chemical pollution. That would mean that investing in wildlife recovery is still a huge priority. We're playing catch up, basically.
Great job, Zeke. I had a question about that graph you showed.
Which one?
Injurious neglect and
Yeah.
costly success. So when conservationists are looking at that matrix, are they ever pressured by political interests or economic interests to do the triaging?
Oh yeah. I mean, conservationists are always under political pressure. You know, it's implemented through the political system. You know, I don't have a specific example that comes to mind, but there have been instances where politicians in a certain state might push for additional wildlife funding in their state to the detriment of another species, and there are species whose conservation is under political pressure to not conserve them at all. I think that many people will remember the owl wars of the 1990s. There's where I'm forgetting the exact species name, but there was a species of owl that was imperiling logging efforts, and there was a lot of controversy over whether it should even be protected. So political interference in wildlife conservation is a real problem. Thank you, Professor Cohen.
So our final briefing for the semester is Professor Rosen's group, and they're talking about urban reforestation. So if you're ready to begin.
Hello, everyone. Hello to the viewers from home as well. My name is Matteo Chiadò. I'm very, very excited to be representing the group that has worked for a whole summer to investigate the Urban Reforestation Act. So let me start by thanking this amazing group and thanking Professor Rosen for all of the amazing advice. On the agenda for today, I'll set a little bit of context behind the Urban Reforestation Act. Then we will investigate its structure and goals. We will see how trees can benefit urban areas. We will touch on the challenges that this bill and urban forestry are facing, and then I will leave you with a little bit of a conclusion. But I would like to start this morning by talking about Yonkers. This article specifically talks about the experience of a few citizens just a few miles north from here that were basically trapped in their own homes because they depended on the air conditioning in order to cope with the extreme heat that has been going on in the past few weeks. The recorded temperature on July 24th was 107 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to the 97 degrees that was expected based on forecast. As you can see from the picture, sometimes it's actually way too often there's not enough tree coverage or shade to find any relief from this heat. And it is specifically this aspect, the way that we've been building cities with a lot of disregard for vegetation, that have disrupted many ecosystem services, such as temperature regulation, the hydrological system, natural air filtration, and in general, terrestrial biomes. And all of this have created very urban-specific problems, such as the urban heat island effect, water drainage issues, air pollution, biodiversity loss, and a plethora of health risks. We also cannot forget that climate change is looming all over this and making a lot of these problems even worse. The reason why we care is because population density through New York State is highly concentrated in urban areas. 91% of the population of New York State lives in cities, and this corresponds to 18 million people in around 90 cities. With a few exceptions, within cities, tree canopy is decreasing. There have been past attempts to revert this decrease. An example of it is the Million Trees Project here in New York City that did a lot of things right. It actually planted all of the trees that it promised, and it raised a lot of awareness on the advantages of trees within urban areas. However, it crucially lacked a long-term plan to maintain those trees and keep them alive in the future. There is already a law that points at vegetation in trees as a potential mitigation tool for all of the problems that I've mentioned just now. And that's the Environmental Conservation Law. The Urban Reforestation Act that we're talking about right now builds on top of the Environmental Conservation Law by creating a funding stream for urban forestry, allocating those funds out to the cities through the state, and also defining a few key activities for the success of this program. According to Assemblymember McMahon, that is the sponsor of this bill, there is a potential to collect $11 million per year, and this corresponds to 7,500 trees per year. And this might seem like a relatively small impact compared to the 1 million tree project that we talked about just before. However, it is an opportunity to create a small incremental change with a long-term focus. More in detail, the Urban Reforestation Act works on 3 different laws. It amends the Environmental Conservation Law that we just talked about by creating the dedicating funding stream, mandating the hiring of professional foresters, calling for a few specific activities such as planning, planting, removal, and pruning. It also amends the highway law by creating a $1,000 annual fee on billboards that are visible from highways and thoroughways through the state. It also sets a few rules to protect small businesses. Finally, it amends the finance law to create that fund and distribute the funds out based on grants and population density. But let's take a step back. Why are we talking about trees and vegetation? How do they help in urban areas? One way that they help is by addressing the urban heat island effect, which is the effect by which the temperature within a city are much higher than the temperatures outside of them. A study from the University of South Carolina has shown that vegetation within cities can reduce peak temperature by 2 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And this happens in a couple of different ways. Through evapotranspiration, that is the combination of evaporation of water from soil and surface, and the transpiration of the water through the leaves of these trees, but also more mechanically by preventing solar radiation to arrive to the surface below the canopy of the trees. They also help with reducing stormwater runoff. And this is especially important as with climate change, we're expecting extreme events to become much more frequent and intense. This happens through increased infiltration, and this is more of a property of the soil in which the plants are located that is able to absorb a lot more water compared to the impervious surfaces that we've been using to build our cities. We also need to mention increased evapotranspiration, like we mentioned before. Instead of having the water flow in our pipes, it's released back out into the air. And then more mechanically, trees help directly intercept rainwater, so slowing down that peak amount of water that hits our drainage systems immediately. Trees also help with improvement in air quality. A study that focused on New York City showed that they are able to filter up to 11% of particulate pollutants and other gases. This happens by trees being able to absorb gases via their leaf surface cells, but also through the physical structure of the branches and the leaves of the trees. They obstruct and disperse airborne particles in general. Among other benefits, we need to mention the decrease in energy load throughout the year. There's a reduction in cooling demand in the summer and a reduction in heating demand in the winter that can sum up to peak energy load reduction of 10%. They also help with human health. We've mentioned how they help with decreasing temperature and therefore also decrease heat-related illnesses. But also closeness to vegetation and proximity to vegetation help with reducing stress, lowering blood pressure, and boosting the immune system. And finally, vegetation and trees have a very obvious relationship with biodiversity. They provide a habitat for local species. They help by reducing noise, which happens to be a major hurdle for ecosystems to be established. And finally, they also create corridors for wildlife to move from hub to hub within cities. While all of these benefits are obviously very positive, it is important to highlight a few challenges that this act and urban forestry in general need to face. First of all, the Urban Reforestation Act has unfortunately been blocked before. in 98 and in 2008 it was already proposed. And back then, the billboard lobby, which I need to remind you is the funding stream for all of these activities, was able to defeat the bill. What is changing here in 2022? Well, there is a supermajority through the legislative branches in New York State, but also bills that tackle environmental issues are much more popular today than they were back then. A second very important challenge is that with the Urban Reforestation Act, we're talking about a long-term investment. On average, trees take 30 to 40 years to reach full maturity, and only then all of those benefits that I talked about before are able to be seen. In cities, this is even harder because in cities, trees have a lot more challenges to compete with in order to reach that maturity. Some of the stressors that they face are restricted root space, the soil composition being completely different to the one that they can find in nature, the water quality, quantity, and frequency that they receive, and also an increase in invasive species and disease threat because cities are major hubs of trade and exchange. So this puts a lot of pressure on successful maintenance in the long term of all of these trees. And in order to ensure that this maintenance happens, we can use short-term and long-term goals. In the short term, these are very tangible and easy to understand, like a net increase in trees in urban areas, the survival of new healthy trees that have been planted just in the past 3 years, and the survival of existing trees that are maybe a little bit older. However, we cannot forget the long-term goals that are the reduction in surface and ambient temperature, the stormwater runoff reduction, and improvements in air pollution and public health. The challenge here is that attributing all of these benefits specifically to trees is extremely difficult because of a couple of different reasons. On one side, there might be other activities that are addressing those specific problems and changing a little bit what the expectation is, but also there's climate change looming all over this, especially with rising temperature and an increase in storms that might change the stormwater runoff expectation there. So urban vegetation is a very promising tool to mitigate a lot of the problems that are caused by the way that we've been building cities and that are made even worse by climate change. The Urban Reforestation Act, while it might seem like a relatively small intervention, has the potential to impact a lot of people, and it's definitely a step in the right direction. Thank you very much. I'm happy to open it for questions.
Good job, Matteo.
Thank you, Sion.
Anyway, so I understand why urban forestation is important, but I'm still a little bit confused on what the connection between billboards and urban forestation is, because, you know, when I think about these environmental problems, a lot of the time the people who are, for example, let's say there's like chemicals in a river, the person who's responsible for paying for that is usually the pollutant, right? Polluter. But in this case, it seems a little bit more convoluted. And also just, I'm thinking about like funding streams from billboards, really how sustainable is that, right? So just curious to know the connection there.
That is a very, very good question. One thing that I would like to mention is the historical context on how this act was created in the first place. The first time that it was proposed was 98, where the world of advertising would have looked much, much different than it does today. Regarding the amount of budget that we can expect from something like this, I believe it's something that we will tackle next year, and we're going to be able to have much better estimates of what the billboard funding stream can bring to this act. Thank you for the question.
Matteo, congratulations for the presentation and extend the compliments to your group as well. Recently, we had some field trips with the urban ecology class, and we've met some restoration project in the city of New York. And you mentioned in your presentation that there is an increasing awareness of this urban forestry issue. And do you have data regarding if this increasing awareness increase the green areas in New York, or is decrease the green area? How these things going on? Thank you.
That's a very, very good question. Earlier on in the presentation, I mentioned that with some exceptions, urban areas are losing tree canopy. One exception to this is New York City in the past, in a specific section of the past 10 years. And that was because of the Million Tree Project. It actually did plant a lot of trees through the city. However, we found also data about other cities throughout the state that keep losing it. An example of it is Buffalo. Buffalo has been losing 500 trees per year through the past 5 years. Even though it has been planting trees throughout. And that shows that even though there is an effort to keep planting these, and so the awareness is there, it is still not enough to compete with the loss of vegetation through many of the cities of New York State. Thank you very much. Take time out.
Well, we have just seen, I think, some excellent presentations. Let me make one point about the connection between billboards and trees, in case you're wondering. So Lyndon Johnson's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, pushed for something called highway beautification. This was one of her issues. And there were rules made about how close you could have billboards to interstate highways. And that's why you don't see on interstate highways a lot of billboards very close to the road, the way you used to have on U.S. highways. In fact, what happened is they moved them further and made them bigger, but that's a different story. But I think the connection between sort of the natural environment and billboards was really this idea that you should be able to travel down a highway without seeing a lot of commercial signs. And this is a 50 or 60-year-old issue, so I didn't expect anybody here to know much about it, but I actually studied it and think it was an interesting effort. And of course, what happened was like I said, they just removed the signs went further away, and then with electric signs, you know, they just light up the whole neighborhood. So it's how sometimes rules get destroyed. In any case, excellent briefing. So a couple of thoughts about your work this semester. First of all, these briefings were excellent, really, really excellent. And I know that we get used to it because we keep seeing each other doing this, but this is really a spectacular demonstration of an ability to take a lot of complex information and boil it down to 5-10-minute briefings. This is a really important skill to have in a world that's very complicated. The decision makers only have so much time and so much bandwidth, and you've got to get across key messages to them and be thinking about, do I really need this? Part of what you had to do in putting these briefings together is make a lot of trade-offs about what information should we be presenting. And I'm sure it was painful to leave out some of the things that you knew. A clever way to deal with it is to put them in the appendices and plant some questions in the audience. So good job for those of you who did that. An interesting way to deal with that kind of a problem. But the point is, though, that it's the analysis of what's important and what's central that each of these groups today, each of your groups did really, really a spectacular job. Those of us who haven't been part of your group could follow the discussion. We understood the science. We understood what you were talking about, the definition of the problem. And so you need to think about that as a really significant accomplishment. And I'm reminding you of this because when you're in the middle of this, it just seems like, oh, that's what we're doing. But when you get out of this class and you're taking classes with some of your SEPA colleagues in electives next semester, you'll see they don't know how to do any of this stuff. And it will be frustrating to you. You'll be in a group, and instead of the 10-minute briefing, it'll be 25 minutes, and there you go. But the world is built around being able to focus decision makers on what's most important. And you really did a wonderful job of doing that. I think the other thing that I am really pleased to see is how kind you are to each other and the culture of the program, not trying to compete, not trying to show each other up, but in fact, congratulating each other on the work. And I like that for two reasons. One is we're in a field that's very challenging, and we need everybody here to be in it, and we need everybody to be working together. This is a complicated field. You know, Professor Cook has a background in veterinary medicine, and Professor Palmer is actually a real scientist, and then there's, you know, Professor Johnson, Professor Apps, and Professor Rosen and I who, you know, have different kind of backgrounds. The point is we all have to learn. Yeah. I don't mean to say that it's lesser, Howard, you know, just, in any case, the point is we have to learn how to talk to each other and how to understand each other. One of the things that I found in my career so far is that scientists are really pretty bad at understanding public policy. They don't know it, though. And so they propose all these things that, you know, don't get anywhere. So this fellow won the Nobel Prize for proposing a carbon tax in the 1970s, which I knew from the beginning of my studies would never happen. And guess what? The proposal that went through the Congress was all incentives, only a little bit of a penalty on methane, very small. That's already happening. The point is that we need to be in a dialogue with people from different disciplines and be able to explain to each other what we know about how the world works. And that's part of what you're learning how to do in this program, and you're doing really effectively, and you just provided us with 5 demonstrations of those facts. So I'm going to congratulate the groups. I'd like everybody to give everybody a round of applause for a great job. And let me say, I'm really looking forward to the fall semester when we talk about management, which is something I know something about. So we'll see you all next semester.